title of my paper today is Gesture Ecologies, Sound Art and Compositional Practice. Gesture is commonly discussed in relation to writing and rhetoric as either a representational ally to speech or as remediated into digital media. In relation to composition more generally, I examine gesture from the perspective of genre, broadly in the context of popular music, but in particular in relation to Clay Spinuzzi's notion of genre ecologies. In the same way that activities bring together various written genre into collaboration as genre ecologies, composing improvisational sound art gathers materials, digital effects, electrical cables, analog amplifiers, sound waves, walls, human affects, through a variety of gestures, everything from plugging in cables to twisting knobs on a soundboard. This move from genre ecologies to gesture ecologies is a particular feature of sound art, but also cuts across all forms of material composition. It is human gesture that often completes the material circuits that bring together the analog and the digital, the oral and the textual, the human and the non-human, into networked collaborative relations. Compositional practice, then, becomes most basically a gestural mode of response in relation to the circulation of energies that enact networks and co-produce ecologies. In particular, I'm interested in experimental noise and sound art and how the movements of performance itself respond to technologies through gestures of compositional practice. In the fall of 2013, Thomas Stanley and the other two members of his ensemble, Mind Over Matter, Music Over Mind, came down to Columbia, South Carolina from DC to give a lecture and a performance. Thomas is a professor of media arts and a sound artist. Bobby Hill, a longtime radio DJ and music archivist in DC, and Luke Stewart, a young and upcoming musician in the DC jazz and sound scenes. The visit was part of my ongoing research project on composition and sound, a chance to interview the group, learn more about Thomas's current book, The Execution of Sun Ra, and film their performances. Researchers always hope that such work changes our thinking, and by chance, the experience changed the terms through which I had been thinking about human-non-human networks in relation to composition and sound. Thomas is in certain ways a classic avant-gardist. This random cut from his Facebook feed caught my attention just prior to their visit. Unless we can develop a generation of musicians capable of emulating more than the musical style of these masters, their uncompromisingly fearless embrace of innovation and discovery, we are truly lost. It's not about jazz anymore. Genres are dead, all of them. What matters is discovering what music can do for us and has not been done before, and soon. The first time I saw Thomas perform and speak, his comments on genre stood out and stuck with me. He argued that young people today are continuing to play out the music of their parents, whether that is hip hop, rock, metal, or even indie music as an extension of 80s post-punk. This, for his generation and mine, was unthinkable. The entire point was to find and invent our own genre in contrast to what came before. Thomas wonders aloud where the desire for new forms of expression is gone, a desire that we might consider a classic anti-genre move of the avant-garde. Genre and the anxieties of authenticity that often go with it are a significant factor in popular music. Keith Negus argues that any revolutionary style operates across a continuum of three approaches to genre. Genericists who take up a specific genre style at a particular time and rarely, if ever, waver. All I have to do is think of AC/DC, right? They haven't changed in 40 years. Pastiches, who see a style that has become popular and include it in their set along with other styles. And synthesis, who draw on the elements of an emerging generic style, but blend them with elements of other genre to create a new and distinct musical identity. In Negus's typology, however, is focused more on popular music. The avant-garde, on the other hand, is grounded in a conception of anti-genre. Synthesis isn't enough to become revolutionary. As David Novak makes clear in his recent book, Japanoise, Music at the Edge of Circulation, it is often the staunch attempt to resist pre-existing genre that paradoxically drives the emergence of new genre. Novak boils down an array of responses from the noise artists he interviews, some of whom disavow use of the term altogether, to one, practitioners that see noise as an extreme form of rock or electronic music, and two, those who deny any relationship to music whatsoever. Noise is pure sound that can't be categorized or understood as music. Nevertheless, the terms noise, noise music, and Japanoise always show up through his research as designations for the genre. The total incommensurability between noise and music echoes for him modernist avant-garde projects of anti-art, which attempt often vainly to keep emergent forms of expression from being subsumed into the dialectics of historical categories. But despite this anti-genre position, noise became a genre through a feedback loop with music. As it proclaimed absolute opposition, it was at the same time recorded and distributed in musical formats, LPs, cassettes, CDs. It functioned exactly like other underground musics of its time period that emerged through recorded forms of circulation. In my interview with Thomas, Bobby, and Luke, I asked Thomas if he thought sound art was becoming a genre and presented a basic rhetorical approach. Genre aren't universal forms, but emerge through recurring rhetorical situations and inductive attempts to produce fitting responses to those situations. As the responses that seem effective get repeated in similar situations, the forms and rhetorical strategies coalesce into what we consider a genre. My question was that if sound art is becoming a genre, what is the recurring situation that it fittingly responds to? Thomas, as you might guess, pondered the question for a moment and said that he didn't have an immediate response, but would think about it. Knowing his adherence to the avant-garde position and the fact that he isn't in the discipline of rhetoric and composition, this was perhaps a fitting response. The question, however, was a genuine one. I'd been interested in sound art and reading more about it since I had first seen Thomas perform. As a practice, it can be traced back at least to John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds in 1952. But at that time, it was considered experimental music. Noise as a genre, as Novak traces its emergence, comes from the 60s Canadian group Nyla Spasm Band, who considered themselves musicians, and their later uptake in Japan in the late 1980s and into the 90s, which turned their work away from music and further toward noise. Sound art, as a designation, solidifies circa 2006 with Brandon Lobel's book, Background Noise, Perspectives on Sound Art, which traces its history and emergence as a significant art form into the 2000s. The move, of course, is away from music and toward the sonic, sound itself as an affective rather than signifying. The move is away from something like genre that signifies, but paradoxically towards sound art as its own distinctive practice. It doesn't take much to see that my initial question, based on fitting responses, might not be enough to answer it. Since the field's turn toward rhetorical approaches to genre through Carolyn Miller's Genres of Social Practice, rhetoric and composition has turned from situations to ecologies. Spinuzzi's genre tracing through organizations, of course, makes this move. Rather than looking at one level of interaction where the text responds to its most immediate context, Spinuzzi expands situatedness across three levels: a macro level of an entire organization or activity system, a meso level of action at the level of the interface among users, technologies, and texts, a micro level of operation focused on non-human functions of code up through situated user innovation. Spinuzzi is interested in how each level interacts, how each level co-constitutes or co-produces the others, and how innovation at one level affects the other levels. The macro transpires historically and culturally across days, months, and years, informing the other levels largely unconsciously. The meso emerges over minutes to hours, often through conscious goal-directed human action, and the micro in minutes to seconds through habitual, tacit, unconscious, or technical protocols. This model complicates the predominantly deterministic cause and effect logic of rhetorical situation and its relation to individual genre. Spinuzzi is interested in how historically emergent activity informs human actions through layers of co-productive mediation and moments of operation, all of which feed back into the process. The innovative outcome of this messy emergent system is genre ecologies. Not one genre as a fitting response, but multiple genres collaborating across levels. Official organizational genres such as reports collaborating with public genres such as maps, and unofficial genres such as sticky notes. Unique emerging situations often require this kind of multiplicity as the source of innovation. Perhaps not unlike Negus's synthesis of popular genre, but more explicitly including a larger set of actions and technologies as co-productive agents that result not in synthesis of a new genre, but in the network of a new genre ecology. Later that night, after their performance at Conundrum Music Hall, as all the bands were packing up, Thomas leaned over to me and said, "I've really been thinking about your question as I've been watching the other performances tonight. And I don't think sound art is a genre, but is instead a set of common gestures." Just as my question sat with him, his response has sat with me. The artists that performed that evening, Mind Over Matter, Music Over Mind, Halverson and Stewart, and About the Window, all share compositional practices not typical with other musical genres. Instead of typical instruments such as guitars and drums, sound performances are more likely to include tables, computers, and a vast array of mixers, turntables, and stomp boxes woven together with what seems like miles of cable. In Japanoise, Novak has one of the best descriptions of this practice that I've read, so I'll quote it at length. Ikeda Keiko is setting up her gear. A 2 feet by 4 feet waist-high table has been brought onto the stage, and she is pulling mixers, voltage converters, commercial guitar pedals, tape recorders, and homemade metal boxes of wires and buttons from a small suitcase onto the stage floor. She places the items one by one across the table, throwing the chaos together into a jumble of individual units, each brick-like effect pedal trailing a wire down to a clump of 9-volt power transformers on the floor, stuck like barnacles onto a power strip winding out to the front of the stage. Bending down to grab a coil of 1/4-inch instrument cables, Akita quickly connects each piece of electronic gear to the next, plugging the output of a mixer channel into a distortion box, into a digital delay, then into a small graphic equalizer. All of them fed back into her block-like mixer at the center of the table, and then back out of the mixer again into another set of pedals, a different distortion, another equalizer, a phaser, a filter, a sampler, as the system builds on itself. This set of practices, much more than an established musical form, connects a broad array of sound artists and noise musicians. The point of the practice is largely improvisational and emergent. The production of sound through the complex feedback loops made possible by the system, grounded in a set of movements, actions, and gestures. In Becoming Beside Ourselves, Brian Rotman looks to move rhetorical gestures beyond a realist model of representation and a social constructivist model of meaning into what we would now consider a new materialist orientation that sees such moments of bodily gesture as forms of co-productive mediation. For Rotman, these gesturo-haptic movements inform the production of both objects and subjects, typically through digital networks. Gesture itself becomes significant outside of any cultural system of meaning or subject in control of its outcome. Rotman writes, "The gesture is not referential. It doesn't throw out bridges between us and things, and it is not predetermined. No algorithm controls its staging. It would be better to speak of a propulsion which gathers up again in an impulse, of a single gesture that strips a structure bare and awakes in us other gestures." Rotman gives us a gestural mobility that hasn't been coded hermeneutically. Its mode of action is inactive and mediational, governed more by protocols and rhythms than standard or recognized forms. It is a performing that is forming, an intuitive improvisational practice that is more ontologically inventional than phenomenologically interpretive. There's a scene in the video we shot of the Conundrum performance where Bobby is just opening a gig bag and pulling out cables in a seamless and flowing set of gestural movements that would rarely be considered part of composition or compositional practice. But this is precisely the kind of thing that we wanted to capture through our research method of using video. The traces of these actions that compose the networks and enact the ecologies. In Internet Invention, Ulmer talks about the capacity of video to allow us to record a moment like this and loop it over and over. It allows us to see the world differently than any other culture before us. It produces a new kind of affect with only the potential to become a new kind of meaning. This is what sound art is after too, not the repetition or even synthesis of a musical or generic meaning, but an experience of sound in the improvisational feedback loops of that moment that hasn't been produced or experienced before. These gesture ecologies function at Spinuzzi's meso and micro levels, the circuits of feedback between human action and electronic operation. But as Novak makes clear, these levels fold over and extend out into the macro level and the emergence of new genre. Noise as a genre, he argues, is produced through circulation and feedback between Canada and Japan. Noise artists in Japan imagine Canada as the original noise scene heralded by the Nihilist Spasm band in the 60s. Through the band's influence, the Japanese artists produced more contemporary versions of noise in the 1980s and 1990s that circulated back to North America through recordings and fanzines. Consequently, contemporary audiences in North America see Japan as the originators of noise. Each place imagines this great originary noise scene in the other place, which fuels its own innovation and production. But the scene in each place only consists of a small number of fans, artists, and venues. It's not San Francisco in the 60s or Seattle in the 90s from which a genre is disseminated. As a genre and a scene, noise primarily exists through performance and circulation. Its location is not in a single place, but in the movements and emergent feedback loops of gesture ecologies.